Mark had always dreamed of visiting London. For years, he'd saved up for this trip, imagining himself strolling through historic streets, sipping tea at quaint cafes, and snapping photos of iconic landmarks. His wife, Lisa, and their 2 kids were equally excited. It was supposed to be the perfect family vacation, a chance to create memories they'd cherish forever. But as Mark stepped out of the taxi near Buckingham Palace, little did he know that his dream holiday would turn into a cautionary tale. The morning air was crisp, and the palace grounds buzzed with energy. Tourists from all over the world milled about, cameras in hand, eager to catch a glimpse of British royalty, or at least the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Mark felt a thrill run through him as he joined the crowd. This was it, the moment he'd been waiting for. But as they approached the gates, reality began to clash with his expectations. The throng of people was thicker than Mark had anticipated. Families with strollers, groups of schoolchildren, and selfie stick-wielding travelers packed every inch of space. No matter how hard he tried, Mark couldn't seem to get a clear view of the guards standing solemnly in their red tunics and bearskin hats. Every time he thought he found a good spot, someone taller blocked his line of sight. Frustration started bubbling inside him like water boiling on a stove. "Come on, move," he muttered under his breath, shifting from one foot to the other. His patience was wearing thin, and the heat of the midday sun wasn't helping either. The kids, sensing their dad's irritation, grew restless too. "Dad, can we go closer?" his youngest son asked, tugging at his sleeve. "Not now," Mark snapped, instantly regretting his tone when he saw the hurt look on his son's face. Lisa gave him a warning glance. "Relax, Mark. We're here to enjoy ourselves, remember," she said softly, trying to diffuse the tension. But Mark couldn't relax. His mind was racing with thoughts of wasted money, missed opportunities, and how unfair it all seemed. Why couldn't these people just stand still? Why did everyone have to jostle and push? As if things weren't bad enough, someone accidentally bumped into him from behind. Mark stumbled forward, dropping his expensive camera onto the pavement. The screen cracked slightly, and panic surged through him. That camera was supposed to capture memories, not become part of the disaster itself. Anger clouded his judgment, and he turned around, ready to confront whoever had dared ruin his day. But before he could say anything, his eyes landed on something else entirely. A royal guard standing nearby, completely unfazed by the chaos around him. To Mark, the guard's stillness felt mocking. Here he was, struggling to even see anything, while this guy stood there like a statue, not lifting a finger to help anyone. Something inside Mark snapped. All the frustration, the heat, the broken camera, it all coalesced into one irrational thought. If no one's going to fix this mess, then fine. And that's when Mark made the decision that would change everything. For the worse. Mark's anger had reached its boiling point. The guard's calm demeanor, which was meant to symbolize discipline and tradition, only fueled his growing rage. To Mark, it felt like the guard was deliberately ignoring the chaos around him, ignoring him. His thoughts spiraled out of control. What's the point of even having these guys here if they don't do anything? He grumbled under his breath, clenching his fists. The cracked camera in his hand seemed to mock him further, a reminder of how everything was going wrong. Without thinking, Mark glanced down at the ground. Near his feet, he noticed a small patch of sand from a decorative flower that lined the palace fence. It was an odd detail, almost unnoticeable, but in that moment, it caught his eye. An idea formed in his mind, one so impulsive and reckless that it bypassed all logic. Before he could stop himself, Mark bent down, scooped up a handful of the gritty sand, and stood up straight again. For a split second, doubt flickered in his mind. "What am I doing?" he thought. But then he remembered the frustration, the jostling crowd, the broken camera, the guard's indifferent stance, and his hesitation vanished. With a surge of misplaced bravado, Mark took a step forward and hurled the sand directly at the guard's face. The grains flew through the air, catching the sunlight as they arced toward their target. Time seemed to slow down as the sand hit the guard square in the face, scattering across his cheeks and settling on his uniform. For a brief moment, there was silence, a collective gasp from the crowd as everyone processed what had just happened. Then, the murmurs began. Did he really just throw sand at a royal guard? Someone whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. A few people shook their heads in disbelief, while others whipped out their phones to record the scene unfolding before them. Some shouted disapproving comments at Mark, calling him disrespectful and foolish. One woman even clutched her chest, muttering, "How could anyone do such a thing?" Meanwhile, the guard remained eerily still, as though nothing had happened. Years of training kept him rooted in place, his expression unwavering despite the sudden attack. Not a muscle moved, not even a blink betrayed his emotions. To an outsider, it might have seemed impressive or admirable, but to Mark, it only deepened his irritation. Didn't this guy realize he'd been insulted? Wasn't he supposed to react somehow? But Mark's fleeting sense of satisfaction quickly gave way to unease. As the reality of his actions sank in, he froze, staring at the guard with wide eyes. What had he done? The weight of his impulsive decision pressed down on him, and for the first time, he noticed the disapproving glares from the crowd. People were pointing at him now, some shaking their heads, others whispering angrily among themselves. Security personnel stationed nearby sprang into action almost immediately. Two officers approached Mark with stern expressions, their movements deliberate and authoritative. "Sir, please come with us," one of them said firmly, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. The tone left no room for argument. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, he allowed himself to be led away, his heart pounding in his chest as the crowd parted to let them through. As they walked, Mark couldn't help but glance back at the guard one last time. The man hadn't moved an inch, standing tall and composed as if nothing had occurred. The image stuck with Mark, a stark contrast to the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. He felt a mix of shame, fear, and confusion, all tangled together in a knot he didn't know how to untangle. And as the security officers guided him farther away from the palace gates, Mark realized that this trip, which was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime, had taken a dark and unexpected turn. As Mark was led away by the security officers, the crowd around Buckingham Palace erupted into a mix of shock and disbelief. People whispered furiously among themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval while others couldn't help but stare at the scene unfolding before them. Did that really just happen? One tourist asked, her voice tinged with astonishment as she held her phone mid-recording. The footage of Mark throwing sand at the guard had already started circulating online, capturing every awkward and cringeworthy detail for the world to see. For the guard himself, however, nothing changed. His training kicked in seamlessly, ensuring that he remained completely still despite the chaos swirling around him. Even as tiny grains of sand clung to his cheeks and uniform, he didn't flinch or brush them off. To anyone watching, it was almost surreal. A living statue standing firm against not only the ridicule, but also the weight of centuries-old tradition. The discipline required to maintain such composure was something few could truly understand. Yet here he was, embodying it perfectly. Nearby, palace staff quickly assessed the situation. A medical team arrived within minutes to check on the guard discreetly, making sure there was no damage to his eyes or skin from the sand. While the act itself may have seemed harmless to some, even a small particle in the wrong place could cause irritation, or worse, especially given the precision needed for his ceremonial duties. As they examined him, the guard continued to stand tall, only breaking his posture briefly when instructed to do so by the medics. Meanwhile, Mark's family stood frozen near the gates, unsure of what to do next. Lisa clutched her purse tightly, her face pale with embarrassment and worry. Their children looked up at her with wide, confused eyes. "Mom, why is Dad in trouble?" the youngest asked innocently, tugging at her sleeve. Lisa sighed deeply, struggling to find the right words. "Your dad made a bad choice," she finally said, her tone soft but strained. She wanted to defend him, to explain that this wasn't who he really was, but deep down, she knew there were no excuses for what had happened. The atmosphere grew tense as more police officers arrived on the scene. They cordoned off the area where Mark had been detained, speaking quietly with the security personnel who had initially intervened. Passers-by stopped to watch, some snapping photos or recording videos, while others simply gawked in disbelief. One man shook his head and muttered, "Tourists these days have no respect." Another woman chimed in, "It's not about being a tourist, it's about common decency." As the gravity of the situation settled over everyone present, Mark began to feel the full weight of his actions. Surrounded by stern-faced officers, he realized how drastically things had spiraled out of control. Just moments ago, he'd been frustrated and annoyed, lashing out impulsively without thinking of the consequences. Now he was facing real repercussions, and judging by the expressions of those around him, they weren't going to be minor. Back at the palace gates, life slowly returned to normal. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded as scheduled, drawing cheers and applause from the crowd. But for many who had witnessed the bizarre incident, the memory lingered long after the music faded and the guards marched away. Conversations buzzed about the American guy who had thrown sand, turning what should have been a peaceful day into something far more dramatic. And though the palace grounds regained their usual charm, Mark's actions left an indelible mark, not just on the people who saw it firsthand, but also on social media, where news of the incident spread like wildfire. By the time Mark was escorted to a nearby police station, hashtags like #Sandgate and #RoyalRespect had begun trending worldwide. The story of the angry tourist and the stoic guard was officially out there, immortalized in memes, tweets, and viral videos. For better or worse, Mark's name would soon become synonymous with poor decision-making, and there was no turning back now. The police station was a stark contrast to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Dimly lit and filled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights, it felt cold and impersonal, a place where mistakes came to be processed and judged. Mark sat on a hard wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly together as he tried to steady his breathing. The adrenaline that had fueled his earlier outburst had faded, leaving him feeling hollow and uneasy. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to fully absorb what had happened, and the reality hit him like a ton of bricks. Two officers stood nearby, speaking in low voices as they reviewed the details of the case. One of them approached Mark after a few minutes, his expression unreadable but firm. "Mr. Thompson," the officer began, using Mark's last name for the first time, "do you understand the seriousness of your actions today?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He nodded slowly, avoiding eye contact. "Look," he said finally, his voice trembling, "I didn't mean any harm. I just lost my temper." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You threw sand at a member of the Royal Guard," he stated matter-of-factly. "That's not just losing your temper. That's assaulting someone who represents British tradition and authority. Do you have any idea how disrespectful that is?" Mark swallowed hard, guilt washing over him. He wanted to explain that it wasn't personal, that he hadn't intended to insult anyone or tarnish the reputation of the guards. But the words caught in his throat. How could he possibly justify something so reckless? As the questioning continued, Mark learned that throwing sand at a royal guard wasn't just seen as assault. It was considered an offense against public order and decency. In the UK, the guards weren't just ordinary soldiers. They were symbols of history, discipline, and national pride. Attacking one of them was akin to attacking the institution itself. The more the officers explained, the smaller Mark felt. His simple act of frustration had spiraled into something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. Meanwhile, back at the palace gates, Lisa and the kids were left to pick up the pieces. She called their hotel to inform them they'd need another room for the night since Mark wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the concierge, trying her best to sound calm despite the turmoil inside her. When she hung up, tears welled in her eyes. Their dream vacation had turned into a nightmare, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. At the station, Mark was given a chance to make a statement. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I'm really sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "I wasn't thinking straight. It was stupid, and I regret it." The officers exchanged glances, noting his remorse but making no promises about leniency. They explained that while apologies were important, they wouldn't undo the damage caused by his actions. Legal proceedings would follow, and the consequences would depend on the severity of the charges. By the time the formalities were over, hours had passed. Mark was fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell until further notice. The cell was small and bare, with only a thin mattress on a metal frame and a single window high above the ground. As he sat there alone, staring at the gray walls, Mark replayed the events of the day in his mind. What had started as a minor annoyance, the crowded space, the broken camera, had escalated into something catastrophic. And now, instead of enjoying dinner with his family or marveling at London's landmarks, he was stuck in a jail cell, facing potential legal trouble. Outside the station, reporters began gathering, alerted by social media posts and eyewitness accounts. Cameras flashed as journalists sought interviews with anyone connected to the story. Some even approached Lisa and the kids, asking for comments. Overwhelmed and embarrassed, Lisa politely declined, ushering her children away from the commotion. "Let's go back to the hotel," she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." Back in his cell, Mark leaned against the wall, his head in his hands. He thought about the guard again, the way he'd stood so still, unaffected by the chaos around him. That image haunted Mark, a reminder of the dignity and restraint he failed to show. As the hours dragged on, one thing became painfully clear. This trip, which was supposed to create happy memories, would instead leave scars on his conscience, his family, and perhaps even his future. By morning, the story of Mark's reckless act had exploded across news outlets and social media platforms worldwide. The phrase "Sandgate" became a trending topic, with countless memes, videos, and commentary flooding Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Clips of the incident, captured by bystanders on their phones, were shared millions of times, often accompanied by captions mocking Mark's behavior. One viral post featured a split image. On one side, the stoic guard standing perfectly still. On the other, an exaggerated cartoon version of Mark mid-throw, complete with angry eyebrows and gritted teeth. It was funny to many, but for Mark and his family, it was anything but amusing. Journalists scrambled to piece together details about the man behind the headlines. Reporters dug into public records, uncovering bits of information about Mark's life back in America. His hometown newspaper ran a small article identifying him as a local businessman who owned a small hardware store. Friends and acquaintances were quick to weigh in when contacted for interviews. Some defended him, saying he was usually mild-mannered, and that this must have been an isolated lapse in judgment. Others admitted they weren't surprised, recalling moments when Mark's temper had gotten the better of him in the past. Meanwhile, British citizens expressed a mix of outrage and amusement over the incident. For many, it wasn't just about Mark. It was about what the Royal Guards represented. "These men stand out there in all kinds of weather, protecting our traditions," said one London resident during a live TV interview outside Buckingham Palace. "They deserve respect, not sand in their faces." Another passerby added, "If you don't like how things are run here, maybe stay home next time." The global reaction was equally divided. Some people sympathized with Mark, arguing that everyone makes mistakes and that his punishments seemed excessive. Online forums buzzed with debates about cultural differences and whether tourists should be expected to know every rule before visiting another country. Others, however, saw no excuse for his actions. "You can't just throw stuff at someone because you're mad," wrote one commenter on Reddit. "That's not frustration. That's being a jerk." For Mark, waking up in the holding cell felt surreal. He'd spent most of the night lying awake, replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. Every grainy video clip, every snarky comment online, felt like a personal attack. He tried to remind himself that he'd done nothing criminal in the traditional sense. No theft, no violence beyond a handful of sand. But the weight of public opinion crushed him nonetheless. He imagined his neighbors seeing the news, his customers reading about him online, and the shame burned deep within him. Lisa, too, was struggling. Back at the hotel, she fielded calls from friends and family back home, each call bringing fresh waves of embarrassment. Their children, sensing the tension, stayed unusually quiet. At breakfast, the youngest asked innocently, "Is Daddy coming back soon?" Lisa forced a smile, though her heart ached. "Yes, sweetheart," she replied softly, "but we need to wait a little longer." As the hours ticked by, Mark's legal situation began to take shape. A court date was set for later that week, and he was officially charged with assault and disorderly conduct. Bail was denied due to the nature of the offense, meaning he'd remain in custody until the hearing. The news hit him hard. Being separated from his family while locked away in a foreign country left him feeling utterly powerless. He thought about Lisa and the kids, wondering how they were coping without him. Guilt gnawed at him, not just for what he'd done, but for ruining what was supposed to be a special trip for them all. Back at Buckingham Palace, life carried on as usual. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded without interruption, drawing crowds eager to see the very guards Mark had disrespected. Tourists snapped photos and marveled at the precision of the routine, seemingly unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the drama that had unfolded just hours earlier. To the guards themselves, incidents like this were rare but not unheard of. They were trained to handle disruptions with grace and professionalism. Knowing their role went beyond mere duty, it was symbolic. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting golden light over London, Mark sat alone in his cell, staring at the blank walls. Outside, the world moved forward, buzzing with chatter about his mistake. But inside, time seemed to stand still. Each passing moment reminded him of how quickly pride could turn to regret, and how one impulsive decision could ripple outward, affecting far more than just himself. The courtroom was quiet but tense, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Mark sat at a small table alongside his court-appointed lawyer, who had been assigned to represent him after he'd spent the night in custody. Dressed in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, now wrinkled and stained from hours of sitting in a holding cell, Mark looked pale and disheveled. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like an invisible force. Across the room, reporters scribbled notes furiously, their cameras clicking softly as they captured every detail of the proceedings. A few members of the public had also gathered, curious to witness firsthand how justice would be served for what had quickly become known as the sand-throwing incident. Outside, crowds continued to discuss the case, some cheering the swift response of authorities, while others debated whether the punishment fit the crime. When the judge entered, everyone stood respectfully. As Mark listened to the charges against him, assault and disorderly conduct, he felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to argue that throwing sand wasn't exactly violent or dangerous, but another part knew better. He remembered the guard's stoic expression, the shocked gasps of the crowd, and the way his actions had spiraled out of control. This wasn't just about sand. It was about disrespecting a cultural institution and breaking laws designed to protect order and tradition. His lawyer did her best to present his side of the story. She emphasized Mark's remorse, explaining that his actions were impulsive rather than malicious. "My client deeply regrets what happened," she said firmly, addressing the judge. "He understands now the gravity of his behavior and takes full responsibility. He is not a repeat offender, nor does he pose any threat to society." But the prosecution countered this argument, highlighting the symbolic importance of the royal guards. They argued that assaulting one of them wasn't merely a personal offense, it undermined respect for British heritage and authority. This is not just about a handful of sand, the prosecutor stated. It's about preserving the dignity of those who uphold centuries-old traditions. Allowing such behavior to go unpunished sends the wrong message. After hearing both sides, the judge delivered her verdict. Mark was fined heavily, a sum so large it made his stomach churn, and banned from returning to the UK for 5 years. While relieved that he wouldn't face jail time beyond his current detention, Mark couldn't ignore the sting of shame. The fine wiped out nearly all the savings he'd set aside for the trip, leaving him financially strained. And the travel ban meant he'd never again walk through London's historic streets or share meaningful experiences with his family in the country they'd dreamed of visiting together. As he left the courthouse, flanked by security officers to shield him from the swarm of reporters, Mark kept his head low. Flashbulbs popped around him, and questions were fired rapidly. Do you regret your actions? What do you have to say to the people of Britain? Mark didn't respond, his jaw clenched tightly as he climbed into a waiting car. Inside, he let out a long, shaky breath, feeling more defeated than ever. Back at the hotel, Lisa and the kids greeted him cautiously. There was relief in seeing him again, but also sadness. Their vacation luggage still lay unpacked, untouched since the chaos began. No one spoke much during the ride to the airport later that day. The once exciting cityscape of London blurred past the car windows, now tainted by memories of anger and regret. On the plane ride home, Mark stared out the window, lost in thought. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to London hoping to create unforgettable moments, only to leave with a lesson in humility instead. Every glance at his children reminded him of the disappointment in their eyes when they'd seen him led away in handcuffs. Every squeeze of Lisa's hand carried unspoken forgiveness, but also a lingering tension that would take time to heal. By the time the plane touched down in America, Mark knew one thing for certain. This trip had changed him forever. The headlines may fade, and the memes might eventually stop circulating, but the consequences of his actions would stay with him long after the world moved on. For now, all he could do was focus on making amends, not just to his family, but to himself. Back in America, Mark's return was anything but quiet. The viral nature of his actions had already reached his hometown, and by the time he stepped off the plane, the story was everywhere. Local news stations aired segments about the sand-throwing tourist, complete with footage from London and interviews with neighbors who either defended or condemned him. His hardware store, once a modest but respected business, became a magnet for curious onlookers and prank callers. Some left sarcastic voicemails asking if he sold sand. Others simply mocked him outright. At home, the fallout was equally challenging. Friends stopped by to check on Lisa and the kids, offering support, but also sharing their own opinions. While some expressed sympathy, saying everyone makes mistakes, others were less forgiving. I don't care how frustrated you are. You can't just throw sand at someone. One neighbor bluntly told Mark when he finally ventured outside. The comment stung, but Mark knew it was deserved. He avoided eye contact, nodding silently before retreating back indoors. Social media didn't let up either. Memes featuring Mark throwing sand continued to circulate, often accompanied by captions like "Anger Management Lesson Number 1" or "How Not to Visit the UK." Online forums buzzed with debates about cultural sensitivity and personal responsibility. For every person calling Mark an entitled tourist, there was another defending him as a good guy who'd made a bad decision. Even late-night talk show hosts joined in, poking fun at the incident during their monologues. One comedian quipped, "Next time you're mad in London, maybe write a postcard instead of throwing sand." Despite the ridicule, Mark tried to focus on repairing what he could. He issued a public apology through a local news outlet, sitting stiffly in front of a camera as he read a carefully written statement. "I deeply regret my actions," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "What I did was wrong, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. I never intended to hurt anyone or disrespect British traditions. I let frustration get the better of me, and I take full responsibility for that. The apology garnered mixed reactions. Some praised him for owning up to his mistake, while others dismissed it as too little, too late. A few even questioned whether he truly understood the gravity of his actions, pointing out that apologies couldn't erase the harm caused. Still, Lisa appreciated the effort. She saw how much Mark was struggling with guilt and shame, and she encouraged him to keep moving forward. "You messed up," she told him one evening over dinner. "But dwelling on it won't fix things. Show people you've learned your lesson." Mark took her advice to heart. He threw himself into work, determined to rebuild his reputation both personally and professionally. At the hardware store, he greeted customers with genuine warmth, answering questions patiently and going above and beyond to help them. Slowly, the awkward stares and whispered comments began to fade. People started seeing him not as the sand guy, but as the hardworking owner they'd known for years. He also made a conscious effort to reconnect with his family. Each night, he set aside his phone and spent quality time with Lisa and the kids, playing board games or watching movies together. On weekends, they visited nearby parks, enjoying simple pleasures without the pressure of planning elaborate trips. These moments reminded Mark of why he wanted to travel in the first place, to create memories, but also showed him that happiness didn't require exotic destinations. It came from being present and cherishing the people around him. As weeks turned into months, life gradually returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be after such a public ordeal. Mark still flinched whenever someone mentioned vacations or London, expecting judgment or mockery. But he also noticed something unexpected. Many people seemed willing to give him a second chance, whether it was a customer thanking him for helping with a home repair or a friend inviting him to a barbecue. These small gestures restored his faith in humanity and in himself. Still, the experience left an indelible mark. Mark knew he'd carry the lessons of that trip for the rest of his life. Patience, self-control, and respect weren't just abstract concepts anymore. They were reminders of how quickly one impulsive act could spiral out of control. And though he'd never forget the day he threw sand at a royal guard, he hoped others would eventually see past the headlines to the man working hard to make amends. Months passed, and Mark's life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. The initial storm of attention had died down, replaced by the quiet hum of everyday existence. But the lessons from that fateful trip lingered, shaping his decisions and interactions in ways he hadn't anticipated. What had started as a dream vacation had turned into a crash course in humility, patience, and accountability. And while it wasn't the kind of experience anyone would willingly choose, it left an undeniable impact. At the hardware store, Mark became known not just for his expertise, but for his calm demeanor. Gone were the days when frustration might bubble over into sharp words or impulsive actions. Now, if a customer grew irritable over a delayed order or a misplaced item, Mark met them with understanding rather than defensiveness. "We've all been there," he'd say with a small smile, recalling how quickly things could spiral out of control when tempers flared. His employees noticed the change too, often commenting on how much easier it was to work with him now. It wasn't perfection. He still had moments of irritation, but he handled them differently, taking deep breaths and reminding himself of the bigger picture. The same shift happened at home. Family dinners became sacred again, free from distractions like phones or TV. Mark made a point to listen actively, whether it was Lisa talking about her day or the kids excitedly sharing stories from school. On weekends, they explored local parks and hiking trails, rediscovering the joy of simple adventures close to home. When someone jokingly suggested planning another international trip, Mark laughed nervously but shook his head. "I think we're good for a while," he said, earning chuckles from everyone around the table. Deep down, though, he knew the scars of London ran deeper than jokes could heal. One evening, as he tucked his youngest son into bed, the boy looked up at him thoughtfully. "Dad, "Are you still sad about what happened?" he asked, his voice soft and innocent. Mark paused, caught off guard by the question. He sat down on the edge of the bed, choosing his words carefully. "Not sad exactly," he replied. "But I am sorry for messing up and letting my temper get the best of me. And I'm trying to be better so something like that doesn't happen again." His son nodded solemnly, then grinned. "Well, maybe next time you'll throw flowers instead of sand." They both burst into laughter, the moment lightening the weight Mark had carried for so long. For the first time, he realized that even his mistakes could become part of their family's story, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of growth. Outside their little bubble, the world continued to move forward. Occasionally, Mark would stumble across a meme or article referencing the infamous Sandgate incident, usually accompanied by a snarky comment or two. At first, these reminders stung, but over time, they lost their power to wound. Instead, they served as a nudge to stay grounded and mindful, a constant prompt to reflect on how far he'd come since those chaotic days in London. Even the travel ban didn't feel as punishing as it once had. While Mark missed the idea of exploring historic cities and iconic landmarks, he found beauty in appreciating what was right in front of him. He subscribed to documentaries about different cultures, read books set in far-off places, and encouraged his kids to dream big about the world beyond their town. In a way, the restriction pushed him to explore new horizons without leaving home. Years later, when the kids were older and memories of the incident had faded into the background, Mark sometimes brought it up during conversations about making mistakes. "Life is full of second chances," he'd tell them, his tone warm but firm. "But those chances mean nothing unless you learn from what went wrong. Don't let anger, or anything else, blind you to the bigger picture." Though he never returned to Buckingham Palace, Mark often thought about the guard who had remained so composed despite everything. That image stayed with him, a symbol of discipline, dignity, and resilience. Whenever frustration threatened to overwhelm him, he'd picture the guard standing tall, unmoved by chaos, and remind himself to respond with grace rather than impulsivity. In the end, Mark's journey wasn't about redemption, it was about transformation. From the ashes of embarrassment and regret emerged a man more aware of his flaws and more committed to doing better. Life wasn't perfect, but it was richer, fuller, and wiser because of the lessons he'd learned. And though he'd never wish for a repeat of that disastrous trip, he couldn't deny one thing. It had changed him for the better.